I know I told you last week I wasn't sure how far we were going to get, whether I was going to go through the whole chapter or part of the chapter, and many of you automatically shook your head, no way, you're going through the whole chapter, and you were right. We are not going to cover the whole chapter. We are going to look at part of it tonight and the rest next week, all right? But tonight we do get to continue our study of Daniel, and so far we have seen from Daniel chapter 1 that we are very much living in a Babylon-like culture today. Listen, it is not a stretch to say that we are living in our own modern-day Babylon. And we are living in a society, in a culture that puts pressure upon us to conform, to give in to this modern-day Babylon. And yet, Daniel chapter 1 also shows us that not only is God faithful to his people in times like these, but Daniel chapter 1 shows us that it is possible for us, his people, to be faithful to him. Not only is he faithful to us, we can be faithful to him, even in spite of the pressure to conform. Now, if you remember, I've told you that primarily this book can be divided into two sections, in two genres of writing. Those first six chapters have a general theme, and they are written in the narrative type of genre. And they are those first chapters. They tell the story of these four Hebrew boys as they try to live out their faith in this culture. These boys have been taken into captivity, and in those first six chapters, it is a big focus on their faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to them. Then, in the second six chapters, we find the apocalyptic genre, and that is where the focus, as you would expect with apocalyptic, is on the future, both Babylon's future and that of the world. Well, Daniel chapter 2 is an interesting chapter because while, yes, we can break the whole book apart into two separate categories and we can kind of neatly divide it, chapters 1 through 6 and chapters 7 through 12, ultimately, Daniel chapter 2 contains both themes and both genres. It has narrative and apocalyptic. It has the focus on faithfulness and the focus on the future. It has all of it in this chapter. And so what we find is that the first part of this chapter is certainly a narrative, and it focuses on God's faithfulness. But the second part of the chapter is primarily apocalyptic and focuses on the future, all within the context of the dream that is given to Nebuchadnezzar. And so for our study tonight, we are going to study it in that manner. Tonight we are going to look at God's faithfulness as we find it in the narrative in verses 1 through 30. And then next week we're going to look at the specifics of the dream and the prophecy that is found in verses 31 through 49. I really enjoyed this study because I already I was studying the whole chapter to prepare for tonight. And so I enjoyed getting to look into the prophetical part that we're going to look at next week, but I equally enjoyed what leads up to that prophecy. And so there's just a lot in this that I enjoy and looking forward to it. So let's begin with the king and his wise men. And click. There we go. The king and his wise men. And the first thing that we're going to notice as we look at this is the king had a dilemma. The king had a dilemma. If you've got your Bible, Daniel chapter 2, look with me at the first three verses 1 through 3. It says, "Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, 'I have had a dream.'" See, everyone thinks Martin Luther King was the first one to say that phrase. No. Anyway, the king said to them, "I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream." All right, now as we're going to find later in this passage, Nebuchadnezzar has only been on the throne for a relatively short time. In fact, verse 1 tells us that this is the second year of his reign. Now, I want to help you understand something, because I've got a chart I'm going to put up here in just a moment. One of the things that can be confusing as you read this chapter is when you look at Daniel chapter 1, how many years of training did Daniel and his three friends have to go through? 3 years. This event in Daniel chapter 2, it says it takes place in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And at the conclusion of this event, we find something interesting. Daniel gets elevated to basically the highest position in the land, just about. He and his friends. And so the question is Daniel still in this 3 years of training, or is he not? Because when you get to the end of the 3 years of training, Nebuchadnezzar is super impressed with these guys. And then you get to chapter 2, what's going on here? And so that's kind of the question. How do we reconcile this? Because most scholars believe Daniel, or I believe Daniel, was finished with his 3 years of training. And then in chapter 2, he gets brought before the king to tell the dream. So how can we reconcile that? Well, that's what I want to show you very quickly before we dive into everything else we're going to look at tonight. All right, get it up there. There we go. Understand that a big part of what takes place here has to do with the way you count the years. And there's all different kinds of ways you can count the years. When they are talking about this and they talk about the 3 years of training, understand, when they talk about that they were going to go through 3 years, that did not mean or imply that it had to be 3 full years. What it does mean is that it took place in a 3-year time period, all right? And so ultimately, what we find is that when Daniel's first year of training began, that began in September 605 approximately, when Nebuchadnezzar took the throne. Now understand, by Babylonian time standards and the way they accounted the years of their kings, that first year, if you did not have a full year, that was considered your accession year, the year you came to the throne. Your first year as king would be considered your first full calendar year. So when you look at it, Daniel's first year of training began when Nebuchadnezzar took the throne. Remember, part of the reason Nebuchadnezzar had conquered Jerusalem when he did was because his father had died, and he was on his way back to Babylon to ascend to the throne. And in that, he conquered and took Jerusalem and took some of those boys back to Babylon with him. That was when the training began. So, Nebuchadnezzar assumed the throne in 605 BC, but it was not a full calendar year. And so, when Nisan, which was March-April time period of 604 BC came around, Daniel is now going to start in his second year of training, and Nebuchadnezzar's first official year as king begins. So you can see this process. So then you get to the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and that would be Daniel's third year. So how do we say that Daniel had finished his 3 years of training? Daniel had probably just finished his third year of training right before Nebuchadnezzar finished his second year on the throne, his full second year. If you think about the way our college semesters work, our college semesters end right around May, right? And so you can just imagine they ended it right around March, somewhere right in that early part of 602 BC, and he had his third year of training. And so this is the time period that we're looking at. And I hope that helps you as you read these passages to see the difference that takes place there, and why we can say Daniel should have just finished his training, and now Nebuchadnezzar has his dream. So Nebuchadnezzar is still new to the throne, and naturally, as a new king who has really just helped conquer the Assyrians, he is beginning to wonder, what does the future hold? What does the future hold for him? What does the future hold for his kingdom? And I imagine that as he thought and pondered these things, I imagine he went to bed many nights wondering about the future, wondering if there was someone who might try to depose him within his own court. Remember, listen, for those that were in my Sunday school class, you know that during that time period, seems like a constant theme that there was always someone within the court who was looking to assassinate the current king and take their place. It was a routine thing in those days. And so he might have been wondering if someone in his own court was plotting against him, wondering if he would have a long reign. He probably wondered if his kingdom would last or if his kingdom would fall. And if so, who would he fall against? Who did he need to guard against? And suddenly, as he's pondering and thinking all these things about the future and wondering what is in front of him, he has a very disturbing dream. Now, we're not told anything about the dream yet, but this dream was so vivid and so disturbing at the same time that it struck a chord with him. Some of you have had some dreams. Normally, I forget my dreams when I have them. But every now and then, you have that dream that just hits you so hard, it sticks with you, doesn't it? And that's where Nebuchadnezzar is. It has struck a chord with him. And he is sure that this dream was important. He knows that this dream had some kind of message that was intended for him. He needed to know what this dream meant. Well, the king, he had a court that was filled with supposedly wise men for this very purpose. It was their job to solve riddles like this. And for Nebuchadnezzar, it was time for these men to start earning their keep. And so he summoned all the various classes of the Chaldean priesthood, if you will, the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. Depending on your version of the Bible, they'll describe them with different words and different orders. But suffice it to say, without diving into what all of these men did in their different interactions, these were all very skilled and very learned men, okay? These aren't nobodies. These are men who had trained in their profession for years. They had books that they would consult, and these books, their sole purpose was to tell them the imagery and what that imagery meant in different dreams. And so they would use that. They would use the stars. They would use omens. They would use spells to try to conjure up whatever was needed in the moment to tell the future or to interpret dreams. Now, no matter what we may think of their methods, these men were powerful leaders in Babylon. They were respected, they were looked up to, they were expected to be people of import and position. They were professionals, and their specialty was the world of the supernatural. But the king is not fully convinced of their abilities. Thus, the king made an impossible demand. The king made an impossible demand. Look with me at verses 4 through 6 for now. Verse 4, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you'll receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. So all these professional wise men come before the king, and they make what seems to be a very reasonable request, right? Clearly, this king has had a dream that has upset him. So they ask the king, great king, we want to help you. Just give us the details of your dream, and we can tell you exactly what it means. It seems like a reasonable request. If he can just give them some details, they can figure out that secret meaning behind the dream. In fact, they were quite confident that if they knew what the dream was, then they could give that king an interpretation that would satisfy him. As I said a moment ago, they literally had books that they could turn and find what every little image was supposed to mean, and they could make up whatever they had written in those books and use it to come up with what their interpretation of the dream was. Whether that was true or not did not matter. It's that they were able to give an interpretation. But this was what they did for a living. So they should have been able to do it. The king, however, he's not having any of it. And he refuses to tell them the contents of the dream. Instead, he displays some plain old common sense. Sometimes we give Nebuchadnezzar a hard time. In this case, he's using some common sense. Because if these guys truly have the powers they claim to have, to be able to speak with the supernatural and interpret the dreams that have been given by the supernatural and the spiritual realm, if they claim they can see into that spiritual realm and divine the future, then there is zero reason why they shouldn't also be able to tell him what the dream was. If you can do this, then why can't you do this? That's ultimately the way it goes. And now listen, there are some who get caught up in arguments over whether Nebuchadnezzar remembered the dream or not. Personally, as I read it, I believe he did remember the dream. After all, if he had completely forgotten it, these men could have made up whatever they wanted. They could have told him, they could have made up a dream, and he would have had no clue if that was right. But quite frankly, it just doesn't matter if he remembered or not. Because his purpose here is to determine, he is determined that he is going to test their supposed powers. They claim to have the power to do this. Let's have them prove it. Then we come to verses 7 through 11. They answered again and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation." And the king answered and said, "I know for certain that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation." The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." All right, so these Babylonian professionals, they can't believe their ears as they hear Nebuchadnezzar talk to them. Nebuchadnezzar must be a crazy man. He's not crazy yet. In a few chapters, he will be crazy, but he's not crazy yet. There is no way that they could possibly tell him his dream. So they request again, "Hey, king, come on, you know we can't do that. Just tell us the dream, tell us what's in it, and we'll tell you what it means." And again, Nebuchadnezzar denies their request. He saw through their ploy. He knew if he told them the dream, then they could conjure up any meaning they wanted, and he would have no way to know if it was true. But there's another subcontext here as well. Remember, as we learn later, Nebuchadnezzar is concerned about the future of his own kingdom. He may, in fact, in this moment, be suspicious of each one of these men as a possible conspirator against him. So that is a big part of it, why maybe he didn't tell them the dream. Maybe he wants to truly test whether they're loyal to him and all of that, whether they can come up with this and do what they need to do. Regardless of their intentions, though, he sees exactly what they're doing. They're stalling for time. They're hoping maybe if they stall, maybe we'll get another day where the king is in a better mood and he'll go ahead and tell us part of the dream. Maybe if we stall, we'll get to a day where the king has forgotten all about this dream. If we can just stall him, we'll be okay. But the king wanted proof that they were able to do what they claimed they could do. He wasn't a fool, and he seized the opportunity to put his wise men to the test. The story is told of Shaka, who was a powerful Zulu leader. Shaka sought to eliminate some of the witch doctors whose power was a threat to his. And so Shaka, in the middle of the night, secretly smeared his hut with blood, and then in a fake rage, he demanded that these witch doctors smell out the evildoers who had done such a thing to his hut. Well, the day arrived for them to expose the culprits. And Shaka's witch doctors, unlike the Babylonian wise men, Shaka's witch doctors tried to bluff their way through it. And so they dressed up in their garb. They went through all their rituals and their dances, and they began to smell out the culprits. They smelled out first one person, then another person. But Shaka, instead of killing these people immediately, the victims of these witch doctors were made to stand over on one side until the witch doctors had finished smelling out all the culprits of this plot. Once they were done, Shaka revealed to his witch doctors that he was the one who had smeared the hut with blood. He had proven in that moment that these men were frauds. They had smelled out hundreds of innocent men. And Shaka, in a turn of events, ordered all of these witch doctors to be put to death. See, Shaka understood something Nebuchadnezzar did. These men claim to have this great power. Let's put it to the test. Let's see if they really are who they say they are. And Nebuchadnezzar, he's ready to expose these men for the frauds they are. Yes, he wants answers, but he wants to know that the answers they give him are real and true. And so these men, after accusing the king of asking for the impossible, they accuse him of saying, listen, you're asking us for something that no other king has ever asked anyone to do before. And after they do all of that, these wise men make a stunning admission. And it's an admission that rightfully dooms them. Notice in verse 11, they admit that there is no one who can tell the king his dreams except the gods who don't dwell in the flesh. Now listen, that was a statement that doomed them. Because these men are men who claimed to be in touch with the supernatural. These are men who claim to be able to be in touch with these gods who don't dwell in the flesh. Ultimately, they are admitting that only the gods can know the dream. But in a way, they're also admitting that they don't have the power to get those gods to tell them the dream. They can only get the gods to tell them the interpretation. You see, they've just admitted. Only the gods know. And Nebuchadnezzar's saying, well, you've got access to the gods, don't you? Isn't that where you get your interpretation from? If they can give you the interpretation, why can't they give you the dream? And so that was the thing that finally doomed them. And then we find, because of that, the king issued a fatal decree. The king issued a fatal decree. Look with me at verses 12 through 16. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then, with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. So listen, the response and the stunning admission of these wise men, it brings the king to his breaking point. He's angry. He is furious at these men. One, he's mad because they are clearly frauds. And two, he's angry because he really wants to know the meaning of this dream. In a way, he was really hoping that one of them could tell him the dream and give him the interpretation. This dream was stuck in his mind. It bothered him. It was giving him sleepless nights now, and he wants to know what it means. And ultimately, because these men were frauds, he commands that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. Because if this group can't do it, none of them can, obviously. So kill them all. It didn't matter who they were. As far as Nebuchadnezzar was concerned, the whole college was painted with the same tainted brush. And so every, quote, wise man in Babylon is condemned to die. And that is where Daniel and his three friends get brought into the picture. Remember, these three guys have just graduated from college, haven't they? I mean, they've just graduated. They just graduated into the wise men. That would tell you why they weren't invited to the original ask by Nebuchadnezzar. These guys are brand new to the game. They're not getting invited before the king. They're not high enough stature yet. And so because of their education, though, Daniel and his friends, they get lumped in with all the others. And when the arresting officer arrives to take Daniel into custody, Daniel is able to find out what's happening. You can imagine his surprise. Here they are. They've just finished top of their class, as we read in chapter 1. They were 10 times better than any of the others. These guys are valedictorian, salutatorian, whatever other kind of Torian you want to come up with. They were the cream of the crop. And they're thinking, man, God's really blessed us. And now they're going to die. And they have no clue why. God, I thought you were blessed, and I thought everything was going great. We're the top of our class, and now we're going to die. And so they ask, why has the king issued such an urgent decree? And upon hearing the reason, Daniel is allowed to go in before the king, and he is allowed to personally ask for a stay of execution. In essence, he goes before the king, and he promises something that the other wise men could not. Daniel promises answers. I suspect that at this point the king remembers this young man. He remembers interviewing this young man at the end of chapter 1 and having seen how intelligent and smart he was and how great he was over all the other members of his class. And he agrees, okay, Daniel, I didn't give the other wise men because they had no confidence, but you seem to have an air of confidence about you. I'll give you your time. I'll give you a little bit of time to see if you can get up and do what the professionals could not. And so, from this, he's given this time, and I want to share a thought here that I see from this. And that is this, that God creates impossible situations in order to reveal His greatness. This is an impossible situation, isn't it? Can you imagine if I asked you, hey, can you tell me what I dreamed last night? And then tell me what that dream means? Most of you look at me like, forget it. Can't do it. That's impossible. Even for Nebuchadnezzar, this is an impossible situation. He's had this dream. This dream is troubling him. And he has no way to get answers now. And he is at his wit's end because this is an impossible situation even for him. And yet it is God who created this impossible situation. And He did so for the purpose of revealing His greatness. It's easy to wonder why all of this took place. Think about it. If God wanted Nebuchadnezzar to know the future, why didn't He just tell him straight out? Could He not have given Daniel a prophetic message and had Daniel go ahead and go before the king and tell him exactly what he wanted him to hear? Absolutely. He could have done any of that. So why this impossible situation? Because sometimes God creates it so that He can reveal just how great He really is. But it also is a situation that tests our response to the impossible situation. See, sometimes He puts the impossible in front of us so that He can see how are we going to respond. Notice a couple of things here. Unbelievers respond with threats and anger. Unbelievers respond with threats and anger. In verse 5, Nebuchadnezzar tells the wise men that if they fail to tell him both the dream and the interpretation, what's going to happen to them? You're going to get dismembered. You're going to get cut into pieces, torn apart, cut into pieces. Your houses are going to be burned and turned into garbage dumps. And he says, and my decision, it's final. Nothing you say or do is going to change my mind. If you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. Nebuchadnezzar with threats. The wise men ignore his request and they repeat for him to tell him the dream, and that only increases the king's anger. He gets angrier and angrier, and how do the wise men respond to his anger? They accuse the king of making an impossible request. Then in verse 12, the king gets violently angry and he orders the executions of the wise men. Remember, it was God who created the impossible situation. And how do unbelievers respond when confronted with impossible situations? The same way Nebuchadnezzar did, with threats and anger. The wise men are angry and irritated at being asked to do the impossible. Nebuchadnezzar's angry and irritated because he can't get the answers he wants. But believers should respond with wisdom and faith. Believers should respond with wisdom and faith. When Daniel finds out his head is on the chopping block, Daniel doesn't respond like all the others. Daniel responds with counsel and wisdom. He responds with tact and discretion. Daniel didn't respond in anger and self-defense like we might. Daniel trusted his God to give him exactly what he needed. Think about it. Here is Daniel, who is still a teenager at this point. He is exiled. He's conquered. He's a slave. And he is now a man marked for death. And yet, in this impossible situation, he is still calm, poised, and full of faith. When faced with the impossible, we must respond with wisdom and faith. Now, with Daniel's faith now set and his request for more time granted, we see the next section of our narrative, and that is the king and the believing prophet. Now, in this section, the focus shifts from the king and his wise men to Daniel himself. This was God's man. This was the young man who would take a stand for God at the risk of his own life. Not just once. He would take a stand for God at the risk of his life many times. This was a young man whose confidence in God was so great that he didn't think of what he did as a risk at all. This was a young man who purposed in his heart to honor God no matter what. That was the secret of Daniel's life. You see, I think I can confidently say that if he had compromised in chapter 1 and eaten of the king's meat, I think we would have never heard Daniel's name. I think we would have no idea who Daniel is if he had compromised. Why? Because you realize Daniel and the other three Hebrews were not the only ones taken captive? You see, the implication is, of all the people offered the king's meat, only 4 didn't actually partake. Daniel and his 3 friends. They're the ones we hear about. They're the ones we learn about. But if he had given in and if he had compromised, I believe we would have never known who he was. But in this crisis, Daniel responded with faith and confidence in God. So let's look at Daniel's handling of the present crisis. First of all, Daniel prayed and trusted God for answers. Daniel prayed and trusted God for answers. Look with me, beginning in verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. As we read about what Daniel did, there are a few things I notice here. First of all, Daniel's faith was an everyday kind of faith. In other words, Daniel's faith wasn't an emergency faith. Daniel's faith wasn't the kind of faith that he turned to only when he got in a sticky situation. It was an everyday kind of faith. Where did Daniel go after he met with the king? He went home. He didn't go out to the wilderness and seek out some special place to go pray. He didn't seek out a religious shrine or some special location where he could fast and pray. No, he went home. He went to the place where he regularly worshiped and practiced his faith. See, home for him was his place where he went to worship. And he then gathered some of his like-minded friends around him, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and he gathered them together for one purpose. I love it. Daniel, he calls a prayer meeting. He calls a prayer meeting. Notice that Daniel's faith led to prayer. Daniel's faith led to prayer. Daniel urged his friends to seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish. He refers to God as the God of heaven. Listen, Daniel's God was a personal and merciful God, unlike the gods of the Babylonians. He was the God of heaven. This name for God first occurs in 2 Chronicles 36:23. It was a name that was introduced in the Bible because God's earthly people had become I'm going to mispronounce this, Lo Ami, which basically means not my people. That's what God's people had become, not my people. And because God had withdrawn from their midst, he became the God of heaven. It's a title for God that belongs to the times of the Gentiles, which the book of Daniel covers a lot. When God acts from heaven rather than acting from between the cherubim in the temple. So, with Daniel's faith full and his friends' prayers ascending to heaven, we see that Daniel's faith and prayer were rewarded. Their faith and their prayer were rewarded. We see that sometime during the night, God revealed the secret to him in a night vision. Listen, we aren't given the details. Did Daniel go to bed? And actually, was he so comfortable with that God was going to give him the answer that he said, all right, boys, if y'all want to keep praying, that's good. I'm going to bed. God's got this. I don't know if he did that or if he stayed up and just continued praying. The reason we don't know is because some visions came as people slept. We know that. Other visions came while people were awake. God doesn't give us the specifics. But what I do know is that God mercifully rewarded Daniel's faith and Daniel's prayer with the answers he needed. And then when God reveals and gives the reward and God gives him the answers and reveals the secrets, we find that Daniel's prayer gave way to praise. His prayer gave way to praise. Look at verse 20. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand." Listen, Daniel goes from prayer to praise. Daniel praised God because he understood that all wisdom and all might are God's. It all belongs to him. It all comes from him. God is the one who is omniscient. God is the one who is omnipotent. He is the one who is able to remove kings and queens from their position of power. He is the one who rules the times and the seasons. He is the one who causes empires to rise or to fall. Daniel understood all of that, and he praised God for being the God with all wisdom and might. And he praised God because he understood that it is God who is the revealer of secrets. It is God who knows what things are hidden in the dark. And it is only God who is the light that can illuminate the hidden things in this world. And we see that Daniel praised God because he understood that it was God who was the source of answered prayer. Daniel understood this answer came not because of any greatness within Daniel. He knew and he understood he had no great power in himself. It was God in his mercy who gave Daniel any wisdom or might that Daniel might have. See, Daniel understood his place in God's kingdom. I'm just the servant. I'm just the messenger. God is the one who runs it all. So Daniel, he now has some good news to share, and beginning in verse 24, he sets out to tell the king what God has revealed. And this is where we see Daniel testifies to God's superiority. I love this section of Scripture. Notice with me verse 24. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Let me stop there because this isn't in one of my points. Isn't it interesting? Daniel, a man of God, what does he ask first? Who does he ask for? Does he ask for his life to be spared? He's asking for these wicked wise men who are sorcerers, astrologers, and consult the occultic. He's asking for their lives to be spared. I just find that interesting. Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I've seen and its interpretation? And Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But, man, I love this verse. But there is a God. There is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. Man, I just love this passage. As the captain of the guard brings Daniel in, notice what the captain of the guard tries to do. Who does the captain try to point at as the answer and the solution and the savior of Nebuchadnezzar's problems? Himself. He's like, hey, king, look who I found. I found someone who can give you the answers you're seeking. He's trying to build himself up, like, look what I've done. And he's making it all about himself. But Daniel, as we see, Daniel doesn't make it about himself at all. In verse 26, the king demands to know if Daniel can tell him the dream and the interpretation. But you notice, the king demands, hey, can you tell me the dream? Can you tell me the interpretation? And does Daniel tell him yes or no yet? No. He doesn't give him an answer of saying whether he can or can't at all. Instead, Daniel wants to make sure before he tells him anything about this dream, he wants to make sure that Nebuchadnezzar understands that Daniel's not like all these other wise men. Daniel points out and says, hey, king, don't forget, all these other wise men, your astrologers, your soothsayers, all of these guys, they can't do this. They can't do this. And the reason why? Because there's a difference between me and them. Daniel's going to make it clear that his God is not like the Babylonian gods. So he put some distance between himself and the wise men, pointing out how none of them could fulfill the king's demand. Then, having pointed out the incompetence of these wise men, Daniel introduces Nebuchadnezzar to the true and living God. And he says, they couldn't do it. He doesn't say, I can do it. He says, they couldn't do it, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. King, it's not about me. It's about my God. My God is the one who's going to do all this for you. In this land filled with distant, impersonal, and capricious gods, Daniel proclaimed his trust in the God of heaven. Daniel reveals to the king that it was this God who had come to him. It was this God who had actually given Nebuchadnezzar the dream that so troubled him. And he basically tells the king, you were absolutely right to think that this dream was important. This wasn't just an ordinary dream, king. This dream had been given to you by God, by Daniel's God. He came to you. He heard your thoughts. He heard you wanted to know the future, and my God decided to tell you. And he came to you and gave you this dream. And he is the one who is choosing to reveal that future to you now. As for Daniel's part, he makes it clear. The secret was revealed to him, not because he's wiser or smarter than anybody else. It was only revealed to Daniel because of God's mercy for Daniel and his friends, and because God wanted Nebuchadnezzar to know the future. He wanted him to know the meaning of the dream. For us, we need to respond as Daniel did. When we face the impossible, we need to turn to God in prayer and faith. We need to have an everyday kind of faith that leads us to prayer. The kind of faith and prayer that leads to praising God for His great mercies over us. And then, when we have that life of faith and prayer and God does what He does in our lives, guess what we need to do? We need to testify not to our greatness. We need to testify to God's greatness in our lives. And we need to let folks know there is a God. That's what we need to do. Now, next week, we are going to get to the dream. And we're going to look at that dream and get into it. So Daniel chapter 2, if you want to look ahead and read through it and study through it, feel free to. Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 49 next week. All right? God bless you. Thank you for being here.